Hey everyone, Erick Stakelbeck here. I know I am a little bit late. I am so sorry. Running a few minutes behind. I know I said 4 p.m. Eastern time. It's more like 4:04 p.m. Eastern time. My sincere apologies, folks. Um, I was filming. Yeah, I wasn't wearing this when I was filming my Philadelphia shirt. I wasn't wearing this when I was just filming for the Watchmen TV show. Just wrapped up, and not to get into the technical jargon of it, but sometimes when you have to upload a file, I send it to my editor, who edits the Watchmen TV show, Chris. He does an incredible job, and had to send him what's called in TV land the pitches or the throws in between segments. You need a transition. I'm on camera and I'm talking about the segment that's coming up, and I toss to it. So I was on deadline and had to film them, and it ran a little bit late. And like I said, the upload was just a little bit slow, but enough talk. I'm here with you. By the way, the Watchmen TV show, if you love the newscast, every day here on YouTube, daily commentary Monday through Friday, and sometimes on Saturday, depending on what the news cycle looks like. Uh, you'll love the Watchmen TV show, folks. Look, I'm not in a studio. I'm on the ground, usually on the Watchmen TV show, usually in Israel. Jerusalem is my second home. Places like Iraq and Jordan and throughout Europe and other spots in the Middle East. We are there every single week for you on the Watchmen TV show. So I strongly encourage you to check it out on TBN every Thursday night at 10 p.m. Eastern time, and then Fridays at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. I really think you'll love the on-the-ground perspective that we bring on the TV show. But hey, the newscast ain't so bad either here on YouTube, and we're glad to have you with us. We've got people already, hundreds of people from around the world, around the United States, Texas, hello, North Carolina, hello, New Jersey, but then we have Ireland and New Zealand. Ireland, I am over 50% Irish. My mom's maiden name was Kilkenny, and her family was from Western Ireland, County Mayo. So that's pretty cool. It's great to have an Irish viewer joining us here. And we've got a good crew here. Someone else from Dublin, Ronald Kavanagh, good Irish name. Great to have you with us. Okay, let's get into it. We've got a lot to discuss today, folks. God bless everyone. So glad you're with us. Almost November. Hard to believe. We want to talk about, I guess the best way I would put it would be that the honeymoon is over between the Biden administration and Israel, if there really ever was a honeymoon, if you could say that. What I mean by that is there have been no major clashes publicly over the past 8 months or so since Joe Biden took office. But now tensions are certainly increasing over a few issues that we want to get into today. Now, the honeymoon would be more between Biden and Naftali Bennett, who just took office in Israel in June. If you remember, things got off to a bit of a rocky start back in January 2021 when Joe Biden took office. He did not call Israeli Prime Minister, I believe, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the prime minister at the time. If you remember, Biden did not call him for what? Was it the first month, 2 months? That he did not even place a call to America's closest ally in the Middle East, Israel. Needless to say, the Biden administration was not sad to see Bibi go. Think of how Biden was vice president under the Obama administration, where he famously clashed with Bibi. There was a lot of tension there. So now I guess the Biden administration was saying, okay, we'll give the Bennett administration a chance. And if you look at it, the Bennett government, Naftali Bennett, who is right wing, is in the head of the government, obviously, as the prime minister. But as we've discussed here in the newscast, that's a far flung government with 8 different parties and all sorts of competing ideologies kind of cobbled together. It's basically the anyone but Bibi coalition, I guess you would say. So Bennett has the right views at the prime minister slot, but there's other people in that coalition on the left, on the far left. There's even an Arab Islamist party, the Ram party, in this coalition. The kind of coalition, definitely some similar ideologies and viewpoints, I would say, to the Biden administration. But then on the other hand, again, you've got Naftali Bennett, you've got Gideon Saar, you've got other people, Avigdor Lieberman, who are definitely more on the right in that coalition. But now that doesn't really seem to matter. Already, we saw a collision course coming over the Iran nuclear deal, which the Biden administration is determined to re-enter. More on that in a second. But two other very interesting issues, folks. The one you just knew was going to come up, quote unquote, settlement building. Is Israel building housing in the West Bank, also known as, and especially known as, the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria here on the Watchman. But Israel just announced they're building nearly 3,000 new homes in Judea and Samaria, where the Jewish people lived some 3,000 years ago. Well, the Biden administration, surprise, surprise, does not like that, nor did their predecessor, their Democrat predecessor, at least before President Trump, the Obama administration. That was the source, Israeli building, of many of the clashes between Netanyahu and Obama. Before we continue, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. We've got a bunch of people. Daniel, our trusty producer, is here. He will be taking your questions. By the way, we're going to look to leave more time for questions today at the end of the newscast. We got cut a little short last week. I shared some of my personal testimony. If you'd like to hear some, it's a small chunk, just one testimony story. But if you'd like to look back and check that out, that was last Wednesday's newscast. I believe that was October 20th. You can check it out here in our archives under newscast. But people from all over the world joining us, this is great. Welcome, everyone. Be sure to leave your questions today, and we're really going to try to get into things at the end, the Q&A. But Israel announces, and this is interesting. Now, folks, I mentioned the ideologically diverse coalition that is running Israel right now. Naftali Bennett, again, at the head. But you have a guy like Benny Gantz, the former Israel Defense Forces chief of staff, who I would say is center-right, more in the middle kind of guy. I've interviewed him in the past, but more in the middle, certainly on social issues, a little more hawkish on national security, being a former IDF chief of staff. That's not surprising. But at the end of the day, he has not been seen as a guy who has been an ally of the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria necessarily. And yet, Benny Gantz's defense ministry wrote off on, approved this new housing that will be built in Judea and Samaria. Again, nearly 3,000 housing units. The world doesn't like this very much, folks. Right away, the Biden administration, and here it comes. They've been treading lightly over the Iran nuclear issue. Bennett met with Biden back in late August, if you remember. What timing? I mean, he visited the White House literally as Afghanistan was collapsing and the U.S. was completing that disastrous withdrawal during the last week of August. But they've been kind of tiptoeing around the Iran issue, and Israel, the new Israeli government, has been saying, okay, we don't want to have a blow up, no pun intended, over the Iran nuclear issue with the Biden administration. But the settlement issue always is a powder keg for the quote unquote international community, led now by a left-wing government in the United States. The Biden, of course, Europe already came out and condemned this. The European Union condemned the new housing, said it's an obstacle to peace, and the usual jargon that comes out of the international community when it comes to these issues. But the Biden administration yesterday released what's been described, the Biden State Department, I should say, State Department spokesman Ned Price, and I'm going to just read it to you straight off my phone. Pardon me for looking down. I want to read the direct quotes for you because it's been described as the harshest critique yet offered by the Biden administration against Israel since Biden took office. And here is what the State Department spokesman said yesterday. That was Tuesday, October 26th. He said about these new settlement plans, Israeli communities, I prefer to call them, but he said the United States is deeply concerned about the Israeli government's plan to advance thousands of settlement units on Wednesday, many of them deep in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. He went on to say, the State Department spokesman, we strongly oppose the expansion of settlements, which is completely inconsistent with efforts, excuse me, to lower tensions and restore calm, and it damages the prospects for a two-state solution. So, a pretty stinging rebuke by the Biden State Department, laying the blame basically for Israel for any clashes between Israel and the Palestinians at Israel's feet, basically saying, folks, this is the bottom line. What the Biden administration is saying is that Jews building homes in a region in which their ancestors lived 3,000 years ago is illegal and could spark a war and tensions and is an obstacle to peace. No mention of Hamas rockets and missiles being an obstacle to peace. No mention of the Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas, Israel's supposed partner for peace, paying salaries to the families of terrorists who attack and murder Israeli civilians that pay for slay program that we've told you about here on the newscast. No mention of those horrific activities as an obstacle to peace. No, it's all about building homes in the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria. God forbid that Jews build homes near where Arabs live. Now, folks, number one, I don't know about you, but I think Jews and any people should be able to build homes and live wherever they want. That's just the way I think. I live here in the United States. You should live where you want to live. You see a nice neighborhood, you see a nice plot of land, you want to live there? Go ahead. You can live there, especially when it's in your ancient and ancestral homeland. That's number one. I think, secondly, should the United States really be wading into this? And I say this all the time. It shocks me. Israel is a sovereign nation. Yet the world, led by the US, and I'm a proud American, but I disagree with this, led by the US, dictate to Israel what it should do, what its policies should be, and how it should act. I've got a great example of that coming up in a second, by the way, the second clash between Israel and the Biden administration. I'm not talking about the nuclear deal. There's another thing that you got to hear about. But how dare the world tell Israel what to do? How dare the world tell Israelis where they can and can't live? That's Israel's business. Israel's a sovereign nation. And I know we'll have commenters come in and say, well, international law. I don't believe Israel is violating international law to build homes in Judea and Samaria. I'm not an international attorney or an official at the UN or the EU, etc. But to me, it seems pretty common sense that people should be able to live where they want to live, and Jews should be able to live in the Jewish homeland of Israel anywhere they want to live in that land. Certainly, it's not the case, but they should be able to. And the world shouldn't be in an uproar and howling with angst when Israel builds some homes in Judea and Samaria. This is madness. The onus for peace and for stability in the Middle East is being put squarely at Israel's feet. And talk about low expectations, folks. Basically, and this has been going on since the Obama administration, not under the Trump administration, but successive Democrat administrations, including the Clinton administration in the 90s, they basically expect nothing of the Palestinians, or should I say, they demand nothing of the Palestinians. They don't ask much of the Palestinians. They ask everything of Israel. I'm not only talking about building homes. Stop building in your land, in your ancestral homeland. That's just part of it. Israel is held to a higher standard than the Palestinians by the West, and that's just a fact. And you could say Israel should be held to a higher standard than the Palestinians. Look, they're a democracy. It's the land of the Bible. Judeo-Christian values derive from the land of Israel. So yes, Israel should be held to a higher standard. And you know what? Israelis would say that. You know what? God put us here to be a light unto the nations. We haven't always succeeded in that charge, but we're trying. And we do hold ourselves, Israelis would tell you, to a higher standard. But what does that say for the Palestinians? If I was a Palestinian, I'd be very offended. If I was a Palestinian who did not support terror and who was not supporting Hamas or the pay for slave program, just a Palestinian going to work every day and trying to raise a family, I'd be very offended by that. And the West, which is all about Western leaders, all about tolerance and diversity. Wow, that doesn't seem very diversity minded to have that view that Israel, as the Western style power, should be always held to a higher standard than the Palestinians. That seems to go against everything the left believes, right? We're told by the left that Judeo-Christian Western civilization is no better than any other civilization. We're told that all the time. Western civilization is nothing special. Hey, Western civilization ain't perfect, folks, but in this upside down world today, it's about the best thing we have going. But we're told all the time by the left and the international community and the intellectual elite that Western civilization is nothing to write home about. It's no better than any other civilization. And yet, when the rubber hits the road, these same voices here in the West won't demand anything from the Palestinians, but they'll demand everything from an outpost of Western style democracy and the birthplace of the Bible, the Ten Commandments, the land of Israel. Does that make sense? I think that's very telling, the outlook. And again, if I was a Palestinian, I'd be offended. There was a term thrown around a few years ago, the bigotry of low expectations, referring to African Americans here in the United States and the left and their treatment of African Americans here in the U.S. I think that can apply to the left's treatment of Palestinians as well. Apparently, they don't think the Palestinians can think for themselves and handle themselves. And if I was a Palestinian, quite frankly, I'd be offended. But the left, the hard left today is known for nothing if not hypocrisy. Now, we've got some good commenters here. We've got thousands of people with us now. This is great. I want to get into that next issue. I talked about the clash and dictating to Israel. Folks, I don't know about you, but this infuriates me as a supporter of Israel to see Israel lectured to and dictated to by other countries. Again, Israel is a sovereign nation. It can make its own sovereign, independent decisions. It doesn't need to be lectured and dictated to by the US and the EU. It's insane that this happens. But here we have another story. The other clash, the first clash, obviously, over quote unquote settlement building Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria. The second clash between the Biden administration and Israel is over the fact that Israel late last week blacklisted 6 NGOs, that stands for non-governmental organizations, basically nonprofit type organizations, Palestinian NGOs operating in Israel and the Palestinian territories. Israel blacklisted them because Israel says, hey, these entities, these organizations are supporting terrorism. In particular, a group called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP for short, a group you don't hear a lot about today. They've been overshadowed largely by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and other groups. But the PFLP, still very active, still very doggedly genocidal and anti-Israel, and they are recognized as a terror group by Israel. So Israel said, hey, these 6 supposed NGOs are supporting this terror organization. So Israel said, no more. You're done. You're banned. You're blacklisted. Again, that is a decision that Israel, as a sovereign nation, is permitted to make. They can do what they want to do. A government was elected in Israel, and again, it's probably one of the most diverse governments in Israel's history. The left usually loves diversity, right? Well, this is the most ideologically diverse, at least, government that Israel perhaps has ever seen. So across a broad spectrum ideologically, a decision was made to blacklist these organizations. Okay, Israel did what it felt it needs to do. Case closed, move on. You are your own sovereign country. You've got a freely elected government. That's your business. Do what you want to do. If you want to build homes in Judea and Samaria where your ancestors lived 3,000 years ago, do it. Go ahead. That's your business. If you want to ban groups that you say are sponsoring terror, that's your business. Do it. That's your right as a sovereign nation, a democratic nation. But folks, that's not the way it went. The world once again was howling. And I love using that word, howling. I mean, you just picture them gnashing their teeth and braying at the moon when these things are done. You really do. The Biden administration, the State Department, and the European Union, the usual suspects, the UN, condemning this without really. Hey, Daniel says, by the way, you've been slow on questions so far. So, folks, bring some questions on because we will answer them at the end of the show. But the world saying we want more details, and also saying to Israel, the State Department, the United States, you didn't give us a heads up. Israel, you didn't give us advance notice that you were banning these 6 NGOs. And by the way, let me read these NGOs for you. I just want to pull it up and read them directly, give you some of the names here just on my phone. Al-Haq is one, a human rights group founded in 1979. The Adamir Rights Group, a group called the Defense for Children International Palestine, the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees, and the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, plus the Bisan Center for Research and Development. Those were the 6 organizations. And they all sound very harmless and innocuous, folks, I know, but many times, and we've seen this in the United States, you have front groups which will funnel money to terrorist organizations. I don't know all the particulars about these 6 groups, so I don't want to say that. But according to Israeli officials, they were involved in nefarious activities supporting a terror group. The United States comes out, the State Department, the Biden administration, and condemns Israel over this and says, hey, Israel, you didn't tell us you were doing this. You didn't tell us you were blacklisting these groups. How dare you? How dare you make such a move without telling us? And the EU said the same thing. It's an impediment to peace. This violates human rights, et cetera, et cetera. Israel says, number one, we did tell you. I mean, the State Department, folks, if you're following the story, is adamant, we weren't told. Secondly, Israel says, we did tell you. There were contacts with the State Department. Maybe the memo wasn't passed on, but we did give you a proper heads up. And third of all, Israel, and it doesn't have to do this, but Israel is sending a representative from the Israeli government to Washington, D.C. in the coming days to explain more why these groups were banned. Benny Gantz, again, a more middle-of-the-road guy, not a fierce, hawkish right-winger all the time, he also supports this. And Yair Lapid as well, who's also a middle-of-the-road guy, the foreign minister of Israel. They're both saying, look, these organizations were up to no good. There are great NGOs out there, everyone knows, but these particular 6 were up to no good, and something had to be done about it. Now, again, that's Israel's right to do what it wants to do. If Israel wants to blacklist these 6 organizations, says they're helping to support terror, that's their right to do it. I'm about to say what I say as a proud, patriotic American. You won't find anyone more patriotic who loves this country more. But what right do we as the U.S. government have to dictate to Israel and to demand a heads up from Israel when it decides to ban 6 groups that it thinks or believes, after much investigating, are sponsoring terror? Israel doesn't even have to give us a heads up if it doesn't want to. I'd say the same about Britain or France or Germany, any other ally, or South Korea. If they want to ban a group they think is involved in terror, hey, it's your country. You're a sovereign nation. I trust your intelligence services. You're a democratic nation. Do what you want to do if you think that's going to help secure your country. I wouldn't demand a heads up from Britain, France, or Germany. Do what you got to do. Yet we're demanding a heads up. How dare Israel, a sovereign nation, make this move without first telling the United States? Folks, do you see something wrong here? Do you see what I'm seeing? What are you thinking if you're Israel? Talk about walking on eggshells every single day as a nation. If an Israeli sneezes, he has to worry about what the world's going to think, and if it's going to cause an international incident, and that if it will cause condemnations and resolutions at the UN. I'm only half kidding. This is how bad the situation is. This can't go on. Israel needs to do what it feels it needs to do. Look, hey, the Bible says as best you can, and Paul says, be at peace with all men. And Israel, as best it can, absolutely needs to be at peace with all nations as much as it can. But folks, at the end of the day, no matter what the nations think, if Israel believes it has to take a certain action to defend itself, defend its citizens, in some cases defend its very existence, It has to do it no matter how much the world howls. And I believe that if Israeli intelligence, after many investigations here and doing their due diligence, which I know they do, concluded that these six organizations were up to no good, I'm going to trust the Israelis. And the United States, as a close ally of Israel, as a fellow democratic free nation, you would think they'd give Israel the benefit of the doubt. Again, especially because this is such a diverse Israeli government. Remember, the left, and I'll include this current U.S. administration, certainly with the left, and in some cases, the hard left. The left told us for years that they opposed Israel and every little move that Israel made about anything. I said sneezing. Again, I was only half kidding. They opposed Israel because of Benjamin Netanyahu and the supposedly radical right-wing government that was running Israel. That's why the left hated Israel so much and opposed Israel so much. That's why the Obama administration was at loggerheads with Israel. It was Bibi's fault. Oh, and yet now Bibi is out of office. Now we've got a government which includes left-wing parties. And yet the same rebukes and condemnation are still coming from the same quarters and the usual suspects. What does that tell you, folks? It tells you it was never about Bibi. I said the same thing a few weeks ago when the so-called squad here in the United States tried to block funding for Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system. Hey, they were blocking funding or trying to block funding, certainly when Bibi was in office. They would have tried to if they had the opportunity. They'd block funding over when a large coalition is in office. And folks, even if a liberal left-wing Israeli government was in office and it wanted funding for Iron Dome, the hard left would try to block that as well. Because again, it's not about who's in charge it's not about who's leading Israel. It's about the nation of Israel itself. And that's the bottom line. I hate to get political. I know some people will say, you're getting political. I don't want to hear about that. And I'm not trying to, but it's kind of hard to deny that the radical left today has taken an aggressively anti-Israel stance. You can put your head in the sand and pretend it's not happening, or you could call it like you see it. Here on the Watchman Newscast, we will call it like we see it. The radical left, by and large, is taking an aggressively anti-Israel stance. That's undeniable, folks. So I'm sorry if you don't like me saying that, but I'm going to say it because it's the truth. And the truth, we need it now more than ever in a time of universal deceit that we're living in right now. So that's the situation. What do you think in your comments and your questions, by the way? I'd love to hear about what you think. Doesn't Israel, am I crazy? Am I even naive to think that Israel as a sovereign nation should be able to make its own decisions without saying, Mother, may I, every time it wants to do something, and without asking the permission of the United States, the EU, the UN, and the world community before it sneezes? Is that crazy to think that? Did Israel not become a sovereign nation once again, reborn miraculously in 1948? Did it or did it not? Does Israel not have free elections? 5 elections, as a matter of fact, in the span of 2 years between 2018 and 2020. It doesn't get more free and democratic than that. To have 5 elections in 2 years. Does Israel, as that kind of nation, not have a right to make its own decisions and determine its own destiny? We know God Almighty, the God of Israel, ultimately determines Israel's destiny and all of our destinies as believers. But doesn't Israel have that right? Or am I crazy? Please comment. And please, if you have any questions on this, I'd love to hear them. And maybe you disagree with me. Maybe you'll get into international law and you will quote the UN and international treaties and the Geneva Convention and anything you can think of to justify the world meddling in Israel's internal affairs. Perhaps you think that Israel should be, some have discussed Jerusalem being an international zone where no one controls Jerusalem. And it's not the sovereign capital of the state of Israel. The world controls Jerusalem. Some believe that should be the situation right now in God's city. Perhaps you're one of those people. I'd love to hear from you if you are, and I'd love to hear your thinking here. And someone commented just now. I'm just looking at the scroll down section here on my laptop as I'm coming to you. That collision course I talked about over settlements, folks, you ain't seen nothing yet, because the Iran nuclear deal, those talks may start again in a few weeks in Vienna. And if the Biden administration decides to ink that deal and revive that horrific, disastrous Iran nuclear deal, things aren't going to go too well. And it's going to be interesting to see how Israel reacts. They've been very tactful so far. And I'm going to move on to Turkey in a minute. We're going to talk Turkey with Thanksgiving just a month out. And let's see, it's 4:35. Okay, we will get the questions after Turkey, actually, very shortly. But it's going to be interesting, I think, to see the tack that the new Israeli government takes. Bibi, hey man, obviously out there speaking before Congress, before a joint session of Congress, basically saying, Mr. President, to President Barack Obama, don't do this deal. It's a disaster. The Iran deal back in 2015. I actually was at that speech at the Capitol. But will Naftali Bennett's government be a little more muted in their response? Say the Iran nuclear deal is revived, and to me, it's an open question right now. Certainly, the West, led by the Biden administration, and Russia and China, they want this deal revived. We know that. But does Iran really want it? Does the new government of Ibrahim Raisi, the butcher of Tehran, as he's known, and again, he ultimately answers to Iran's supreme leader, but at the end of the day, he's very close to the supreme leader, and they are similar in their line of thinking. Does Iran want the deal? I believe that at the end of the day, they probably will, just to get the pressure off and get the sanctions dropped. But how does Bennett react in that Israeli government? Are they more muted in their response? There sometimes is something to be said for, being more action oriented, less wordy, and more action oriented. Perhaps Israel sets back and says it's a fait accompli. This deal is going to happen. Now, what do we do? Perhaps we don't play our hand for the world. Now, they certainly, from Yair Lapid to Benny Gantz to Naftali Bennett over the past few weeks, certainly Israeli leaders have been pretty boisterous in talking about Iran's nuclear program. And also the chief of staff for the Israel Defense Forces, Aviv Kohavi, they've been saying, look, we are planning to do what we need to do, and we will act alone if we need to eliminate Iran's nuclear program. But perhaps once the deal goes down, perhaps Israel goes not radio silent, but you don't hear as much. Things are more subdued for a few months, and all of a sudden one day you wake up and you turn on the TV or you click on your phone or on your laptop, and you see that Israel has struck Iran's nuclear program. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm not saying it's a guarantee there. I am saying that the Iran nuclear deal would make it much more likely. I'm also saying that Israel, and we talked about this on the newscast over the past week, Israel's government last week approved a $1.5 billion budget for an attack on Iran's nuclear program. Again, that doesn't guarantee that Israel will strike, but it tells you that Israel is preparing for any contingency. Number two, on that end, the Times of Israel reported exclusively this week that the Israeli Air Force will begin training for a strike on Iran's nuclear program early in 2022. Now, again, this does not guarantee that Israel will strike Iran's nuclear facilities, but it does show you that Israel is very, very serious. They mean what they say here. And we talked about this on the newscast last Wednesday, and people have commented, this is like the boy who cried wolf. Stakelbeck, you're talking about Israel and Iran constantly, and nothing ever happens. Well, number one, it's my job as a Middle East commentator, analyst, reporter, host, journalist. I'm going to talk about it. This is the big story in the world's most pivotal and chaotic region, the Middle East. It matters to all of us. So, of course, I'm going to give you a lot of updates on the biggest story out of the most crucial region in the world. Secondly, and then we'll move on to Turkey, Israel has teeth behind its words. What do I mean by that? You could say nothing's happened. Are you crazy? Israel and Iran, nothing's happened. The shadow war that's been going on, intensifying over the past year and a half, whether it's Israel striking Iran and Hezbollah in Syria, whether it's Israel and Iran striking each other's shipping at sea, whether it's Israel eliminating Iranian nuclear scientists. carrying out sabotage attacks against Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile facilities on Iranian soil. Iran planning attacks against Israeli embassies. Nothing's happening. The boy who cried wolf. Okay, there hasn't been a full-blown major war, and no one wants to see that. But it would be pretty careless of me and head in the sand to just ignore everything that's happening between Israel and Iran and how things are kind of building towards what will be most likely a major conflict. So that's the situation we have. Israel, it's not just bluster at the end of the day. They've shown that since the modern state of Israel was reborn in 1948, and certainly over the past year and a half. Now we got that out of the way. Let's look at some questions real quick, which we're going to get to. I have to give you a quick Turkey update. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish tyrant, obviously a Muslim Brotherhood style ideologue, basically his AKP party, which has ruled Turkey increasingly with an iron fist over the past 19 years, 2002 now, Erdogan came into power. They are basically the Turkish branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Erdogan has been sort of quiet in recent months. If you've noticed, we haven't heard too much from Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He had been very verbose in previous months, talking about Jerusalem constantly and saying that Jerusalem basically should be the crown jewel of a revived caliphate led by, of course, Turkey, which were obviously the forerunners or the forebears of the Ottoman Empire. Erdogan basically calling for a revived Ottoman Empire and he said, I quote, "Jerusalem is ours." Talking about the capital of Israel, number one, the ancient and ancestral capital of Israel, the undivided capital of Israel. Pretty interesting to hear another world leader say to a nation, hey, your capital, that's ours. That's like the Brits or the Germans saying to the United States, Washington, D.C. belongs to us, not you. You see, because Jerusalem was once under Ottoman control, and again, Turkey was the main purveyor of the Ottoman Empire, because Jerusalem was once under Turkish Ottoman control, in Erdogan's view and in the view of radical Islamists, once under our control, always under our control. So Erdogan said, Jerusalem is ours. And folks, that was only the tip of the iceberg. He made threats against France and Greece. We talked about this on the newscast, consistently calling Israel a terrorist state, harboring Hamas members. And we could get into all day about the ISIS situation with Turkey, how Erdogan allowed ISIS fighters safe transit from Turkey into Syria across that porous border, intentionally made porous by Erdogan. He's been a bit quiet over the past few months. There have been a lot of problems economically in Turkey, and he's been trying to maybe smooth things out a bit with nations that he had been at odds with over the past several years, including nations like the UAE and Egypt, and perhaps even Israel. At least some of the rhetoric coming from Turkey, maybe a bit more conciliatory at times. But now Erdogan is saying, or his administration in Turkey is saying, that Turkey has arrested 15 Mossad operatives. The Israeli security services have been arrested by Turkish authorities, according to the Turkish government. Now, we don't have any confirmation of this. This is a Turkish claim. Key point there, apparently these so-called Mossad spies were of Arab Palestinian descent, most of them operating on Turkish soil. This is according to Turkey. Israel, to my knowledge, has not responded to this charge from Turkey yet. We're going to keep a close eye on that because Turkish media and Turkish government mouthpieces were really playing this up, folks. Could this spark increased tension between Turkey and Israel? Like I said, the Turkish government had been a bit muted in recent months after just, wow, an onslaught of anti-Israel rhetoric and covetous rhetoric over Jerusalem again and again. That, wow, I mean, to covet another nation's capital so openly, to me, is a very big deal. But he'd been a bit muted, had Erdogan in recent months. Now, all of a sudden, we've arrested 15 Mossad operatives. We'll look to hear more on this story, but that's not all. Erdogan up to his old tricks with Israel, but also with the West in general. We've told you on the newscast how he is increasingly moving to the east, into the arms of Iran, into the arms of Russia, which would be more the north of Turkey, but moving out, I should say, moving out of the NATO orbit. Again, Turkey is a NATO member nation. I call them NINO, NATO in name only under Erdogan, but nevertheless, they are a NATO member nation. Turkey clearly moving away from the West and into the arms of the East in the form of Russia and Iran in particular. More on that in a second. Ezekiel 38 and 39, anyone. But now Erdogan is very angry, and I'm going to pull this up and just get the exact nations that he's angry at. He is very angry, and questions in a minute, guys. Let me just finish this. He is very angry that Western nations have expressed support for a Turkish philanthropist named Osman Kavala, who's been imprisoned in Turkey. Now, unfortunately, Turkey has been under Erdogan, has become, I believe, the world's biggest jailer of journalists. It gives you an idea of the trajectory they're going in. But also this philanthropist, his sin, his crime was probably opposing Erdogan's radical policies. Nevertheless, he's in prison. And some Western nation said, look, let him go. We don't believe he should be in prison. And Erdogan says to the US, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Canada, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and New Zealand, he says, you know what? We're going to expel your, that's 10 nations. We are going to expel your ambassadors from Turkey. Get out of here. How dare you tell me who I can and can't imprison? Now, you might say, Stakelbeck, you're being hypocritical. A few minutes ago, you told us, how dare the world tell Israel what to do? And now you're telling the world, telling me the world should be able to tell Erdogan what he should do. I'm not saying that. The world has every right to say to Israel, hey, we don't agree with that. The world, in my view, does not have a right to say to Israel, how dare you make a decision as a sovereign nation without asking our permission first, or at least giving us a heads up? Do you see the difference? The world has every right. If they disagree with what Israel does, a nation, whether it's a US, Germany, France, whoever, can say, Israel, we don't agree with that. That's your right. That's what nations do. And friends do that, certainly. But the world doesn't have a right to dictate and lecture. The world can certainly say to Erdogan's government, hey, we don't think that's right that you've imprisoned this philanthropist. He didn't do anything. And we would like to hold you to a higher standard, Turkey, because you're a NATO member nation that has historically had in the last century or so close relations with the West. We expect more of you. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not dictating. Big difference. That's not dictating to Erdogan and telling him what to do in an almost arrogant way. But Erdogan took it in exactly that manner, and he said that, look, we're going to expel these ambassadors. He has not. Apparently, he's climbed off the ledge. It could have been an economic disaster for him if he did this and really isolated and alienated the West even more than it's been alienated from Turkey under Erdogan. But we're keeping an eye on that. Rumblings once again in Ankara, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, you just knew he wasn't going to stay silent for long, folks. And by the way, between Erdogan, between Russia, and we got into the Naftali Bennett-Putin meeting on the Friday newscast, actually last Friday, the day it happened, October 22nd. Check it out in our archives. We also discussed it on Monday, this Monday's newscast, all there in the archives. Between Russia, what's going on there between Russia and Israel, between Turkey's radical turn, Iran, of course, and Sudan this week. Have you been following this? We mentioned it on, I believe, yesterday's newscast or Monday's newscast. Sudan now in the middle of a military coup. Now, Sudan was on the verge of signing the Abraham Accords peace agreement with Israel. There were some rumblings that Mahmoud Hamdok, Abdullah Hamdok, I'm sorry, who was the ousted now interim prime minister in Sudan. He's under house arrest, apparently, that he was perhaps preparing to travel to Washington, D.C. and sign the Abraham Accords, make it official. Remember, it was about a year ago that Israel and Sudan at least verbally agreed to normalize relations and that Sudan was going to come on board with the Abraham Accords. Is that in jeopardy now? It's interesting because this new military government that's running Sudan, and this general, his name is Burhan, his last name is Burhan. He apparently was an advocate for normalizing relations with Israel, even more than the ousted prime minister who they just overthrew. But what happens now? There's so much instability there. People are in the streets. Does this put the normalization off for the foreseeable future? And does this have a prophetic implication? Many people have talked about that Ezekiel 38 and 39 confederation that comes against Israel in, quote, the latter days. That's what the Bible says. People have named Russia, Iran, Turkey. No surprises there. People have always said, well, we think that Cush and Put and some of these nations, their biblical names, at least Cush and Put, P-U-T, this may be Sudan. But then on the other hand, you say, well, Sudan's making peace with Israel. Well, now that might be off the table. What happens now? Does Sudan, God forbid, take a radical turn? Folks, pray for the people there. And there's Christians there as well who've been persecuted over the years. And we know about what happened in Darfur as well. So pray for the people of Sudan right now. Pray for wisdom and discernment. They were on a trajectory, a gradual, slow trajectory of turning more towards the West and Israel, normalizing relations with Israel. They were taken off the state sponsor of terrorism list by the United States, but not a very pleasant history, including recent history in Sudan. This is a country under the Muslim Brotherhood dictator Omar Bashir, who he himself was ousted in 2019 in a coup. This was a country that harbored Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda during the 1990s. This was a country that was in the Iranian orbit, very close with the Iranian regime and Hamas in previous years. Folks, let's hope Sudan does not go back into that category. But some have commented that, maybe this has some prophetic implications. What's going on in Sudan right now, we don't know. Let's pray for the best in that nation because they need it right now. Let's also get to questions. Got about 15 minutes left. Not bad. Okay. Let's see what we got here, guys. Daniel is sending on some questions. I'm just looking down at my phone. Pardon me. I'm not ignoring you. Trust me. But he texted me questions, and then I kind of look at the scroll down here that we have on the screen. Okay, let's see what we have. A lot of questions about Israel striking Iran's nuclear facilities and the aftermath. What comes the day after, or the day of, I should say. We'll get into that in a minute. What else do we have? This is just a great statement from Jessica Smith, echoing what I said. Why does it even bother people that Israel wants to build homes and communities in their own country? Nobody cares when other countries build homes. You'd think everyone would be fine with it. Well, Israel apparently, Jessica, is a special case in the eyes of the world. Guess what? It's also a special case in the eyes of God Almighty. And the world's going to learn that soon. Let's see. Okay. Let us get into the after effect of an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, if that does come. I believe, number one, how Israel would do it. I'm not a military strategist or expert, but I would say just in following this issue closely, you would think clearly airstrikes would be a component of it. And Israel, these sites, these Iranian sites are deep underground. They're fortified deep underground. Israel would need some kind of bunker busting bomb, you would think, to have a real effect there with airstrikes. That's number one. Number two, Israel has submarines, obviously, that it could use from off the coast to fire missiles as well at those facilities. Number three, you have sabotage, and Israel has used that to great effect. Number four, you have a cyber attack and computer viruses. We saw the Stuxnet virus about 9 years ago that Israel used in tandem with the United States to sabotage Iran's nuclear program. There are many avenues that Israel can go down. It could be a multifaceted type assault on Iran's nuclear program. Again, I'm not a military expert. I don't claim to have inside knowledge of any Israeli blueprint, but I can tell you right now, the blueprints are on the table and they are actively discussing this. It's not me saying it. It's them saying it. They're telling us. Aviv Kohavi, the chief of staff for the Israel Defense Forces, has said this repeatedly, that they are planning. okay, what's the after effect? No matter how Israel does it, and if you look at Israel's track record with these daring operations, and make no mistake about it, Iran is about 1,000 miles to Israel's east, if not more. This would be a daring operation, well fortified, sites obviously deep underground, Iranian air defenses, which are trying to bolster. There's a lot of elements here, but Israel has shown to be very ingenious and have great ingenuity in the way they've conducted daring attacks and missions since 1948 and even before in the modern era. And look, the track record here: 1981, Israel destroying Iraq's Osiris reactor under Saddam Hussein, and 2007, discovering destroying the nuclear reactor of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. There's a track record here, folks. Israel's not going to allow Iran to acquire the bomb, take it to the bank. Does that mean Israel's going to be forced to attack Iran's nuclear program? We don't know, but what we do know is Iran ain't getting the bomb on Israel's watch. Now, the question was, what happens next? I think clearly Israel, if it's going to strike Iran's nuclear program, you would think clearly that Israel would act preemptively to also strike and neutralize Hezbollah, and perhaps even Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. Because look, Hezbollah, folks, and you know this well, we talk about this on the newscast. You've seen me on that Israel-Lebanon border. You've seen me in Hezbollah terror tunnels with the Israel Defense Forces. Hezbollah has some 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at every inch of Israel right now. So when Israel strikes Iran, Iran's going to activate Hezbollah and that entire ring of fire that surrounds Israel. Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Houthis to the south in Yemen, and the various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria to the east and to the north, and of course Iran itself with missiles that it can launch in Israel's direction. Iran will activate that ring of fire, you would think, in response if Israel does carry out an attack against Iran's nuclear program. And Israel knows that. Israel knows right now that it is surrounded by tens of thousands, probably well over 200,000 rockets and missiles, not to mention that growing arsenal of attack drones that we've told you so much about here. Iran is supplying these drones that can be packed with explosives to its proxies across the region. Israel knows that it is literally surrounded. So you would think that Israel preemptively, this might be multifaceted and some things might happen simultaneously. Israel would preemptively act to blunt that ring of fire because you know Iran is likely going to activate it in the event that Iran's nuclear facilities are struck. So, you know, Israel's putting these blueprints together now. The IDF, I'm sure they've had a plan for well over a decade. I'm almost positive they had a plan drawn up in 2012, and there was hesitation because of the possible response of the world. Remember, Barack Obama was the U.S. president at the time. But it seems like Iran's nuclear program is a lot further down the road now, and not in a good way. The levels of uranium that they are enriching, they don't have much fear right now of any repercussions. Certainly from the United States, now that Trump is gone and Biden is in office, they have the Afghanistan example to look at, and they say, we don't have to fear these guys. That's what they're saying right now about the U.S. And the West. And you have an even more radical, if that's possible, Iranian government now with Ibrahim Raisi at the helm. So it is a combustible mix. But Israel has shown a great ability, could we say miraculous ability, to carry out these daring, incredible, and successful attacks time and time again. And some of them have hit Iranian assets, including under Iran's noses on their own soil. So stay tuned. We'll continue to be talking about this, I'm sure. Let's see what else we have. Questions. Field Agent 59 asks, is this new Israeli government coalition sticking together in supporting all of the proactive measures taken by the prime minister in defense of Israel? Good question. We're seeing some cracks, not when it comes to Iran and the larger threats, but certainly over the settlement building that I talked about earlier in this newscast. And by the way, folks, if you missed anything, if you came late, we've got a few thousand people with us. You can catch this entire live stream under newscast. As soon as we're done, we will post it under newscast. You can catch the full hour. But we're seeing some cracks. Again, not when it comes to the big issue like Iran, but the building. The left wing flank of this government coalition led by Naftali Bennett. And again, there's 8 parties together, far flung ideologically. The left wing flank criticized the decision to build up to 3,000 houses in Judea and Samaria. So stay tuned. That's a big issue, and that could lead this government to say it's shaky and tenuous. I think is very accurate when you have 8 parties kind of cobbled together with differing ideologies on a host of issues. Hey, folks, if one of those parties pulls out, that coalition could collapse and Israel could go to elections again. That's how it works in Israel. So we're keeping a close eye on that. Good question. We have time for a few more questions. Let's see here. Sam Frederick says what I just actually laid out. Do you believe Israel would also strike against Hamas and Hezbollah in the event of a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities in order to deter retaliation strikes from either of those proxies? Sam Frederick, great question. I just got into that. I would think yes. Just looking at it, you would think that would be the wise move, right? To say, hey, we know there's going to be blowback. These guys are going to respond. Let's weaken them and take them out before they have a chance to respond. I think back to 1967, the Six-Day War, when Israel basically destroyed the Egyptian Air Force preemptively, when the Egyptian Air Force was on the ground, hadn't even gotten into the air yet. And many say the war was essentially over before it began once Israel took out the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. So could we see that kind of situation, Israel striking preemptively and then taking care of business, so to speak, with Iran's nuclear program? Let's see here. Joyce Meyer. Daniel says, I'm assuming this is not the Joyce Meyer, but if it is, she asks, has there been any recent coming together of Israelis to pray for God to heal the land as they did with the drought not long ago? Well, Joyce, great question. I can tell you certainly, and I'll be back in Israel, let's just say very soon. More to come there. I was there in June 2021. I'll be back very soon. That's your little teaser there. So stay tuned. We'll have more details on that. But I can tell you absolutely there are people in Israel right now praying. I wouldn't say it is a large corporate call for prayer. I'd love to see that. But certainly there are groups, there are ministries in Israel as well, and they are calling for prayer, certainly. But we'd like to see it clearly on a larger scale in the nation of Israel. But certainly there are groups and pockets that are coming together consistently to pray for Israel in Israel. People live in Israel. I think of a great place called the Prayer Tower in Jerusalem, great congregations there like King of Kings. And of course, millions of Christians are praying for Israel around the world as well. Let's see. Do we have time for one more question? I believe we do. Maybe even 2. Let's see. Here's an interesting one, a provocative one, I would say, even. Not intentionally provocative, but Chris7 asks, if Israel strikes Iran's nuclear facilities, would they eliminate Khamenei, the supreme leader, and the butcher of Tehran, the president, Ibrahim Raisi, as well? Wow. I would tell good question and a fair question. I would think no, Chris. I would think the world community, the internet, the international community, they are going to howl, as we said. It's going to be unbelievable. If Israel, especially say the Iran nuclear deal is in place, and Israel goes against the will of the world and goes and strikes Iran's nuclear facilities, and there's blowback. There's a regional war. Perhaps other players get pulled into it. Perhaps gas prices go through the roof around the world. You guys aren't stupid. We have the special forces of the pro-Israel movement here on the Watchman Newscast following us, in particular on the live streams. You guys know the kind of blowback we could see. And when things go bad, the world usually blames the Jews. And here you have the Jewish state Israel at the middle of what's going to come down the pike. So the world's going to be angry enough at Israel for Israel to also assassinate Iranian leaders, heads of state, would really, you would think, push the world into they're literally world leaders at the UN. Their heads may explode on camera. That's how much they'd be gnashing their teeth if Israel did that. So I would think that would be unlikely, but you never know. I mean, in the past, Israel certainly has taken out terrorist leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah in previous years. Certainly, Israel took out Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, last November, but he's not a head of state. That's another level. So I don't know if Israel would go there, but if that thing got kicked off, who knows where it would go, quite frankly. But I think that's a good place to leave it. Kind of an interesting place to leave it. Some great questions today. Really got the gears turning and got you thinking, right? And thinking ahead. We kind of advanced the ball today in the Q&A about all these issues. Okay, we're talking about this. It very well might happen. Then what? What does it look like and what comes next? So I love the questions today, folks. Keep them coming. We will be back with you. I think the next live stream will be next Wednesday, a week from today, which would be, I believe, November 3rd. So that'll be the next live stream. You can keep the questions coming throughout the week. There's so many incredible questions. Someone's asking about the Pope meeting with Biden and prophetic implications there. There's so much. We can only get to so much, but you guys are the best. Love being on here with you with the live stream. Again, sorry I was a few minutes late, but it was for a good cause. I promised. The Watchman TV show we were filming. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. God bless you. And until tomorrow, remember, never hold your peace. See you then. God bless.